We are staying with the Ukraine-Russia story, but today we are moving away from the immediate battlefield and looking at the impact it's made elsewhere, because it's the most cataclysmic global event since the end of the Cold War, and it's affecting every country, not just in the immediate region, although more in the immediate region, say the Middle East and Europe, but across the country, because the event is like that. Old enemies are trying to become friends now. Old friends are discovering new areas of strains and conflicts of interest. Old allies today see that their interests lie on different sides, and everybody is balancing and everybody is moving. So I will give you a summary of that. It's quite a fascinating picture. See, at this point, if UAE and Turkey are coming closer, until the other day, they were like at each other's throats. UAE and Turkey are coming closer. Turkey is going out and saying nice things about Egypt and improving its relations with Israel. Israel, Egypt, Turkey. These are countries that Erdogan has been beating up on all this while, also to drum up his local support, because his friends have been in the Islamic Brotherhood. Now, he has broken away at this point from Muslim Brotherhood and rediscovered new friendships with UAE, Israel, and Egypt. In fact, as we speak, Israeli president, that is Mr. Herzog, has just visited Ankara. So that tells you that there's a big change going on in that region. Why? Because Turkey has interests on both sides. Turkey has interest in Russia, and it has interests in the West because it's a member of NATO. Turkey also has an axe to grind in Syria. In Syria, sometimes Turks and the Russians give space to each other. Sometimes they have issues also between each other. After all, we've seen some really major issues between Turkey and Russia in Syria lately. In 2015, a Russian aircraft, a Sukhoi, was shot down by Turkish missiles. In 2016, the Russian ambassador in Turkey in Ankara was assassinated. In 2020, 34 Turkish soldiers were killed in a Russian airstrike in Syria. Even after that, the two countries continued talking. Not just that, Turkey, because Turkey plays this very sophisticated game. Remember, only 3% of Turkish territory and 10% of its population is in Europe. But Turkey is a member of NATO. So Turkey values its NATO membership. Turkey also is home for a bunch of nuclear weapons, NATO nuclear weapons stored there. So Turkey, in a way, is shopping on both sides of the street. So Turkey is with NATO. Turkey, at the same time, wants to be friends with Russia. It's a neighboring country. It depends on Russian gas. A lot of the gas that Turkey needs comes from Russia in a pipeline that is pretty much owned by Gazprom, the Russian company now, whose value just became zero on international stock exchanges. And Turkey has also bought S-400 missile systems from Russia, the same system that India is buying. Although Turkey has faced American sanctions as a result of that, despite being a NATO country. Now, Turkey has figured that they cannot keep fighting with Israel at the same time, and they cannot be fighting with the Middle Eastern world at the same time. Now, what else has happened, I will tell you. This is not the only big change right now. The other change is the talks with Iran that Americans are having, Americans and the rest, the JCPOA talks in Vienna, are now proceeding at a much more rapid pace. All these things are interconnected, and I'll draw some interconnections for you. Qatar, as we had spoken about in an earlier Cut the Clutter, Qatar has recently been given a major non-NATO ally status by the Americans. That's also happening in the Middle East. And remember, all this while, Qatar was at odds with UAE in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, and I read this in the Wall Street Journal of this morning, and I will share a link with you. You can read the entire story. It seems that both the rulers, or the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who's the de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, and the ruler of UAE have both refused to accept phone calls from Biden, but both have spoken with Putin. Both have spoken with Zelensky also, but they have avoided calls from Biden because, one, they are irritated with America because they think Americans are moving too fast into restoring JCPOA with Iran. They don't like Iran. In fact, they definitely dislike Iran more than they dislike Turkey. At the same time, they are also worried that Biden may put pressure on them to start pumping out more oil, because at the bottom of all this immediately is also the global oil prices. Because for oil producing nations, high prices are good money. In fact, you are today looking at a complex situation where it suits Russia if oil prices go up, because that is all Russia has got to sell, but provided Russia is able to sell. So Russia has to balance that. They want high oil prices, but they also don't want sanctions whereby they can't sell. So to avoid sanctions, if they lower the tempo of the war, or if they make peace with Ukraine, then global oil prices start going down, because then you are back to normal. So Russia has to balance their interests between high oil prices and between the ability to encash those high prices. Then Russia's closest friend right now, China. China may see a lot of strategic benefit in getting Russia to fight America or getting America to fight Russia. It's like the example I use all the time. It's a bit like in old days, Dara Singh saying to any global challenger in his kind of wrestling that, beta, you are sending me a challenge, before that fight with my brother Randhawa. So that is exactly what China is doing to the Americans and the West right now. You want to challenge me tomorrow for global supremacy? Fight with my younger brother, Mr. Randhawa first. If you can get the better of him, then whatever is left for you, battered and wounded, you can come and face up to me. So at the same time, for the Chinese, oil prices going up like this is a disaster, because China is as much an oil importing country as India is. If you see India, on the other hand, India has dependence on Russia for military equipment. India cannot break off immediately, and India cannot be a part of this sanctions situation. But if Russia continues to be in such a crisis, it's a big threat to India. At the same time, India imports 80% of its oil and gas. So that price is going up, and it's already creating a specter of not hyperinflation, but high inflation in India as oil companies adjust to global prices. Similarly, you will find that Turkey, the largest number of tourists in Turkey come from Russia. So see some of the things that Turkey has done in this case, and that's a fascinating story in terms of how countries are making adjustments with this situation. One, on the positive side for the West, for its Western allies, say NATO, it is selling those drones to Ukraine, which is making a big difference in the war. We spoke about that in Bayraktar just yesterday. Erdogan visited Kyiv a day after the Russian government recognized the sovereignty of Luhansk and Donetsk, right? So they've kept their equations with the Ukrainians as well. Two, they have blocked the Bosporus and Dardanelles, invoking the 1936 Montreux Convention. And at the same time, while they are talking nicely to the Russians, they are selling Bayraktar drones to the Ukrainians. They are not sanctioning Russia, but they are blocking the straits for Russian ships. At the same time, see, while he's maintaining his relations, he's talking Putin, because he needs to sustain his friendship with, or his working relationship or cynical working relationship with Russia. His ambassador at the UN, see the adjectives he's used about the Russian action. This is illegal, illicit, unacceptable, unjust, baseless, unprecedented in history. All these are adjectives he's used about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think all the possible diplomatic abuses have been used, except Captain Haddock's vegetarian maybe. So this is the tightrope that Turkey is walking. And you can see why they are doing it. In fact, now Turkey has also organized the first meeting since the conflict began between the Russian foreign minister, that is Sergei Lavrov, and the Ukrainian foreign minister, that is Dmitry Kuleba, in southern Turkey. That will be the first meeting. So that is how Turkey is managing it. And Putin, in fact, had said in the past, Putin and Erdogan like each other. That's why they've been able to manage many crises between them, which also, despite the fact that these resulted in military losses to them, Putin had once said about Erdogan, this is a person who keeps his word, a man. So these are people who think differently. These are all strongmen leaders who also level at some place at a personal level as well. Now see Israel. Israel is the most fascinating story. Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister, was among the first to go flying into Moscow. He did so on a Sabbath. right? On a Sabbath, a conventional, traditional Jewish person or leader will not go out on work. But so he broke his Shabbat, came to Moscow on a Saturday. Because he had to fly over Turkish airspace, he also informed Erdogan that he was going in there. Now, again, Turkey and Israel haven't had the best of ties lately. But once again, in this crisis, I told you, enemies become friends and friends discover new areas of conflict. So he came into Moscow. From Moscow, he went to Germany. He would not have come to Moscow without checking with the Americans. He went to Germany to meet Chancellor Scholz. Then he went back and he's been trying to play the honest broker there. That is getting a lot of criticism within Israel. And in fact, at the same time, he sent Yair Lapid, who is his foreign minister, to Lithuania to meet Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State there. So Israel is also trying to balance it. What is Israel's panic in this? What is the fish that Israel has got to fry in this? Israel is concerned about Iran. Israel has the same concern as this in this case as say UAE and Saudi Arabia. Although in their case it gets more complicated because both are caught in this awful war in Yemen and both have been recipients of attacks from Shia militias or Shia forces supported by Iran, particularly UAE recently when they had those missile attacks from the Houthis in Yemen. And they need more support from the Americans, but they are insecure. And they are most insecure, paranoid about Iran becoming legit again. Iran, by the way, is the most silent country in all this because they know the both sides of their bread are buttered at this point. So Israel's concern also is, one, that there should not be a quick settlement with Iran because they are really paranoid about Iran. If UAE and Saudi Arabia are worried about Iran, Israel is paranoid. It's also a big issue in Israeli domestic politics. With the Russians also, Israelis have an axe to grind because Israelis send out their assets, particularly Air Force, to go into Syrian territory to bomb the pro-Iranian militias and terrorist organizations and their assets. They can only do it with the tacit approval of the Russians who control that airspace. And in fact, it's the Russians who also then prevail upon the Syrians not to use against Israeli aircraft the S-300 missile systems that the Russians have given them. Those can be very effective and quite deadly. So Israel also has these multiple interests, but the big interest there also is Iran. In fact, within Israel, there is a lot of criticism of how the government is handling this. I read an article in Haaretz, and that article quotes Yuri Misgav, who says, quote, "We are walking on eggshells and trying to protect Vladimir Putin's inflated honor." And he goes on to say, instead of hanging up on a psychopathic, ruthless dictator, Israel is acting like a Russian client state. Now, this is strong criticism, but you know where Israel's government is coming from. Alan Leal, who's a former Director General of Foreign Affairs in Israel, he has said, just because we have to bomb Syria once or twice a week, doesn't mean that we have to submit to all of Putin's demands like this or suck up to Putin like this. So once again, that shows you the conflict of interest that Israel has. Then look at UAE. I told you about UAE worrying about Houthi attacks because they are very insecure about Houthis. They are very, very insecure about Iran. And that's one of the reasons they are irritated. Because today, if anybody can up the output of oil quickly, it's UAE and Saudi Arabia. But both are not doing it because both don't want to help the Americans and NATO to relax. Both want the pressure to be on. So somehow the motivation to settle quickly with Iran goes away, because if Iran becomes legit again and sanctions are lifted, then Iran's power in the Middle East, particularly with Shia militias and Shia communities, will also go higher and higher. And by the way, UAE is the largest investor in Russia. In fact, almost 80% of foreign investments in Russia come from UAE. So that has its own impact as well. Now, look at the state of the world and see how each country is responding to this. In faraway Venezuela, because Americans now realize that they can't sanction all oil-producing countries in the world because that's too cruel on the rest of the world. You sanction Venezuela, the largest oil reserves in the world. You sanction Iran. You now sanction Russia. So where will the rest of the world go, particularly your allies like India, for example, or Europe? Or even in America, every speech of Joe Biden's, he talks about the stress or pain that American people have to face at the gas pump, right? So nobody wants prices go up. So that's the reason they are thinking of lifting sanctions on Venezuela. Venezuela's President Maduro, who until now has been such a quote-unquote bad guy, he's saying that he can produce enough oil every day to stabilize the world. Venezuela has also just released 2 American prisoners. So, why? Because Venezuela also now wants to get over the sanctions. Their economy is completely crippled by these sanctions. So this is a bit like, the example I can use is of COVID, right? They say that if you're a perfectly healthy human being with no comorbidities, most likely COVID will wash through your system. But if you have any comorbidity, it can be anything. It can be diabetes, high blood pressure, tuberculosis, asthma, cancer, anything. If you have any comorbidity, then the threat becomes greater. And sometimes a person might have more than one comorbidity. And that is what's happening right now. See, you want to see Turkey? Turkey needs the gas from Russia. Turkey needs to keep its membership of NATO because that's where the power comes from. Turkey needs the tourists from Russia. Turkey at the same time, because it's maintaining its friendship with Russia, cannot at the same time be at odds with Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So these are the multiple comorbidities in a way. I'm just using an example that Turkey is carrying. Even if you look at India, we don't have one comorbidity, that is dependence, our military dependence. But the second also is the oil prices, because we simply cannot afford oil prices going this high. China has an oil price issue. Israel has an Iran issue, which is very important for them. This is almost a life and death issue for them. But they also have an issue about continuing on to be friends and to be retaining the protection of America. That's also the issue with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants oil prices to be high. It can help the Americans. It does not want the Americans warming up to Iran. At the same time, higher oil prices also suit it. So everybody has to balance between all this, and all our countries are driven by these, once again, if I may misuse that word, comorbidities. So this is a virus. If this war is a virus, that's a politically correct thing to say, no problem. If this war is the equivalent, geostrategic equivalent of the COVID virus, then all the countries with any weakness, either in its immune system or any of these comorbidities, will then be stressed. And that's how all these countries are responding to the situation.